Thank you for coming on. I really do appreciate it. And
I'm delighted to be with you.
thank you. And I also wanted to say, the book is incredible. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I think that it's brought up a lot of really excellent points, especially as it relates to what's going on today. And that's really what I wanted to talk about, because I think if you look at some of the reports, whether you're looking at the Washington Post or the Kaiser Family Foundation polls or the New York Times, they're all citing all these disturbing upticks in cases related to mental illness, and whether it's substance abuse, alcoholism, suicide, it's all there. And I guess my first question would be is how can we best approach this time where there's just so much hopelessness?
Well, that's a good question, Adam. And to answer it, let me give a context. Prior to the COVID issue, American culture had become more anxiety and depression filled than at any time in its history. Anxiety is now the #1 mental health disorder, replacing depression, but it's #2. And there are 3 reasons that scholars give for this. The first one is the pace of our lives and the constant overstimulation of technology and media, which produces stress. So that's #1. #2 is a complete breakdown in community and human contact. America is inordinately individualistic. I think individualism is a good thing, but it's too individualistic. And so there's not enough community, especially community where there are close and growing friendships that are involved in that. And what we're finding is that connecting on social media is just not doing the trick. The third reason is, believe it or not, the emergence of moral relativism, and here's why. This is, by the way, secular scholars. It's not what I'm saying. I agree with it, but and it's because given moral relativism, there is no conviction that there are clear and right answers to our dysfunction and our mental illness, that if we follow these practices, they are filled with wisdom and truth and goodness. Because wisdom, truth, and goodness is relative to one person and not somebody else, and there just is no such thing as available wisdom. Well, that's going to give people hopelessness. So what happens now when you add to that this very odd life change that we're all experiencing? Well, people get anxious when their lives undergo a major change. When you move, it takes up to 18 months to start functioning normally again. If you change jobs, so change of a significant nature is always a bit anxiety producing, and this one is especially difficult. And one of the reasons is because of the nature of what's called solitude. This is a spiritual practice where you cultivate the ability to be quiet and to be alone. And and maybe to go away for a weekend and have a solitude retreat at a monastery. One of the things that happens if you do that is the first 6 hours or so, you start getting anxious and fidgety and extremand nervous. And the reason is that all the anxiety that's been building up inside of us, we have been suppressing and been keeping busy so that we don't have to feel it and get in touch with it. Well, when the busyness is gone, guess what happens? That anxiety starts bubbling up to the surface, and you have to feel it and just let it and release it and let it go. But if you don't, then you start. I think what's happening to people is that they're bored. They're starting to feel their anxiety because they can't be busy. And one of the techniques that people use to not be as anxious is they project their anxiety onto something that's a little easier to worry about, namely getting sick. For most people, because usually elderly people do, but the vast majority of Americans aren't in danger. But instead, they'll obsess and worry on that, so they don't have to worry about the fact that the way they've approached life is broken. And so just to summarize my answer, I see the situation as an incredible invitation, Adam, to make some life changes that will be so spiritually and emotionally health inducing that we don't want to miss this opportunity.
Well, that was a great answer. And, you know, I think that one of the changes that I hope occurs, particularly in the Christian community, is opening up more to different methods of approaching how we treat mental illness. I know that you, in your book, you touched on how that one church that you went to, how they freaked out when you mentioned medications, and how it's okay to take medications, and how if I recall correctly, you weren't invited back, right?
Well, I still haven't, and that was over 10 years ago, and I'd spoken there 5 or 6 times and had a blast. They loved me, but never got invited back.
Wow. Yeah, but you know, I do think that is a change that I would like to see in more Christians, especially in a time like this. I think that what the church could do better overall is approaching psychological treatments, whether it's therapy or medications, in a more healthy fashion. You know, and last summer, actually, one of my close friends that approached me, and she basically told me, "Oh, you know, I've been dealing with a lot of anxiety, and I'm thinking about taking medications, but I don't feel like I should, because I feel like I should be able to just handle it, just God and me, and that's it." And so, I think that's a really bad trap to fall into, that many of us fall into, and I think that hopefully in a time like this, we can, Christians can move more towards accepting these kinds of treatments and understand that the Christian faith and medical treatment for our conditions can improve. We can combine those two. Do you think that the current outbreak and the current situations with the lockdowns, do you think that's going to be an opportunity for the church to approach that in a more healthy fashion?
I do. I think that the rejection of medication is just based on ignorance, a lack of knowledge. And I wrote a book about my journey in all of this and the things that pulled me out of depression and anxiety that really worked. And I lay out a very careful case for the appropriate use of medications, psychiatric treatment. And I'll just give you it's biblically consistent. I can't go into it, but just get the book, and I give texts that support this sort of thing. But the primary reason is a correct biblical anthropology about the nature of a human being. And when you come to realize that I am a soul with a body, I have a brain and a heart, muscle, and nervous system, and organs, and all sorts of things, and I have what I would consider to be a spirit, which is a compartment of my soul. It's a faculty of my soul. Then when you get anxious and depressed, it becomes a holistic thing. It isn't just limited to my spiritual compartment. If it starts there, it could start in my breakdown of my spiritual life. It could start with some kind of psychological trauma. It could start with a breakdown in brain chemistry because of stress. But what happens is wherever it starts, it bleeds into the other areas. And so if you're going to get rid of anxiety and you're going to do it biblically, you attack it with every aspect of a biblical understanding of what we are. So therapy, especially if you can get a good Christian therapist, there are certain spiritual practices that are absolutely powerful that I mention in the book. You begin to work on those, and then finally get medicines. Because look, it's hard to praise the Lord if you hit your thumb with a hammer. You got to get your hammer so it's not hurting anymore, and then you can praise the Lord and mean it. Well, when your brain is depleted of certain chemicals, it is at that point impossible to choose joy and peace. But what you can choose to do is to do certain things that will get you to that place. And one of those is good medicine. And this medicine, you talk to a psychiatrist. I would not go to a GP myself. If I could go to a psychiatrist, they're specialists in brain chemistry, and that's what they do. But if you can't, go to a GP, but they will assess your situation, and they have a wide range of tools to choose from that can help you get well in 3 or 4 months. And I would never recommend to somebody, Adam, to just take meds. No, that would be crazy. You take meds, you find a really good Christian counselor, and find some new spiritual practices that will help you draw closer to the Lord. And it's all of the above. And I don't know why anybody would want to just do 1 or 2 of those. If you're in need, go after this thing and do it holistically.
Yeah, I do think that is definitely a good approach for sure. Actually, you're not the only one at Biola who's implored people to get the necessary help for any kinds of psychological conditions. I wrote an article around this time last year about how Christians could do a little bit of a better job in how they approach mental health. And I talked with Jeff Volkmer. I'm sure you know him.
I do.
Yeah. So he basically mentioned it. He referenced it as a broken arm, where he basically said, just like you should go to the emergency room or the doctor whenever it is that you break your arm, you also need to understand when you're psychologically depleted and when you need to get the help that you need. And it's best to treat your psychological well-being just as well as you would treat your physical well-being.
Well, I agree completely, Adam. And let me just say, maybe to close this out, if you're watching us and listening to us, and you have some questions, a little bit of a check about not doing medications, I'm just asking you to please give me a hearing. That's all I'm asking. I wrote the book Finding Quiet. I'm not trying to sell a book here. I'm just saying that in that book, I lay out what I consider to be a reasonable case for why this is okay. In fact, why it makes sense. And all I'm doing is asking you to get the book and give me a chance to make my case. Now, if you end up saying I don't think his case is any good, fair enough. But don't be ignorant about it. At least look into someone who's contending that this is biblical and it's not inappropriate. You owe it to yourself to rethink that and to read something that will help you.
Yeah, absolutely. one of the things that and this is a little bit more on a personal note for me, but I think one of the areas that I'm really happy that you brought up in the book was the different methods of treatment. So one in particular was EMDR, and I think that's one that I feel like many people are still kind of learning about, but it's also something that I think that many people should become more aware of. I personally have undergone some EMDR as well.
That's why I have too.
Yeah, it's rough, and it can be a brutal process, but yeah, I mean, I've struggled with some anxiety and some PTSD in my life, and so
Yes.
um, I think that bringing up EMDR is something that I think that was a great move, because I think it's something that more people need to learn more about, and I do think that this time in particular has been incredibly traumatic for a lot of people, and so do you think that once everything dies down, with with the civil unrest, with the restrictions, do you think that that's a method that people should consider, should it suit them?
Well, I do. And if a person reads about it, they might initially think that it's kind of kooky. But actually, there has been a ton of research done, and this is now mainstream therapy. I mean, I have a friend that's a buddy of mine who's been a therapist for 30 years, and he engages in talk therapy, cognitive behavioral and other kinds, which is so biblical, it's not funny. But he has tools in doing EMDR, and he clearly weaves that in to his helping of people, and it's very effective. And so what it does is it dislodges certain what we might call sores that are kind of stuck in your brain. It dislodges them in a way that talk therapy can't quite get to. And then it's painful maybe when it comes up, but you're in the room with the therapist, and then you can release it, and it helps it leave, and it doesn't stay bothering you. So I highly recommend it as a tool that it's worth trying and seeing if it helps you.
Yeah, I think I think from my personal experience with the EMDR, I would highly recommend it as well to those who see it as a good path to take when it comes to treating their condition. One of the First of all, do you have about 6 more minutes, or is that?
I do. Yeah.
Okay. I also wanted to touch on the 4-step solution, because I think that for me personally, that was also something that I found incredibly helpful. How did you did you come up with that solution, or do you know how that solution was formed?
I tweaked it, but I first learned about it from a Christian neuroscientist that teaches at UCLA, and he's a devoted believer. And he wrote a whole book on the 4-step solution. And I had started practicing it years ago and found it to be tremendously valuable. Let me just say very quickly to our listeners and viewers that what I learned in all of my research in order to deal with my own anxiety is that in addition to therapy and medication, I found that anxiety and depression are largely, not entirely, but largely learned habits. They're habits that are formed. And if we have learned those habits, we can unlearn them. And that's positive, good news. So Paul talks about this in Romans 6, and I can't go into detail here, except he does talk about the repetitive presentation of a body part to God as an instrument of shalom or peace or flourishing or well-being. So the stomach in fasting, or there are other ways of doing this, but what I focus on is the regular presentation of the brain and the heart muscle, and I explain why, to God as instruments of having joy and peace replace anxiety and depression. And I'm telling you honestly, it's worked. But like with any habit, you're trying to form new habits, and the 4-step solution is one of the 4 practices I mentioned in Finding Quiet that that Adam's talking about here, that needs to be practiced habitually. You have to do it over and over again. And step 1 is to we might just call this attending to your self-talk. And one source of anxiety and depression is the way we talk to ourselves throughout the day. The problem is it's such a habit that we don't notice it. It's kind of almost subconscious and below the radar. And then we end up at 1 o'clock in the afternoon thinking, my gosh, why am I down? Well, you've been telling yourself certain things all day. So the first thing you do is you invite the Spirit, according to Psalm 139, 24 to 26, to search you and to know you as you do yourself. This is not undue introspection. It's asking the Lord to help you become more aware and catch the way you're talking to yourself negatively. You know, like people just don't like me around here, right? Made a fool of myself the other day. And so you try to catch those and call them for what they are. Namely, that this is nothing but a habit. This has nothing to do with reality. This isn't telling me how people feel about me. This is my bad habit. Now, the second thing you do is you try to name what kind of a distorting message that is. So I list in there 10 of the major ways that we have distorted thoughts. My favorite that I'm really good at is catastrophizing and what-ifing. So I would go, oh my gosh, what if this happens? And then I'd say it would be just horrible. Yeah, but what if that happens? And so I would tend to engage in what if, catastrophic, or magnifying self-talk. And once I was able to label what I was doing, they've learned that if you can just put a name to an illness, you can withstand more pain. Just the act of naming it, it's crazy. But what that does is it gives you a little sense of control over, you know what's going on. Third step is that once you've said, okay, that's just a habit, it's got nothing to do with reality, and in fact, I know what kind of habit it is. It's in my case, I'm what-ifing and anticipating bad things, and I'm blowing up, so they just would be horrible if they happened. The third step is that you've got to refocus your attention and get away from that thought and get into what's called flow. And flow is when you're so caught up in something that you lose track of time. You're really into it. And it doesn't have to be spiritual. I mean, it could be reading a Christian book or looking at the Psalms. It could be reading a novel, or checking your favorite websites. And I'm a Kansas City Chiefs fan. I love to go there and see what's going on with the team, or anything that gets your attention so that you're really focused. Now, that's important, because if you stay and fight that thought, if you fight it, what that's doing is digging the groove in your brain deeper so that it becomes even more of a habit for you to go that direction without even trying to do so. And so you want to get rid of the groove that triggers that habit, and you don't want to sit around and get in the mud with that thought. So I go into focus, turn away from it, and do something for a while. I first had to do it for 20 minutes. Now it's down to 2 or 3 minutes. And so once I've done that, and I can sense that I've got distance from this thought, it's not going to trouble me, then I can go back to it and I can just reflect upon how I did. Well, was there any way I can improve? And try to evaluate how I did the first 3 steps. Now, if you practice this several times a day, when you catch a thought, in a 2 to 3 month period of time, most people are going to begin to get rid of those negative patterns, and it will release joy and peace in your life. And the proverb says, "As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he." And I think this is just an application of changing the way you think of yourself and talk about yourself. So it's an application of a very biblical principle.
All right. Well, I have 2 more questions before I let you go. But do you think that because you mentioned grooves, and I know that you mentioned grooves in the book as well, grooves in the brain. Do you think that giving these habits a physical, like a physical image or a physical description, do you think that helps people? I'm a firm believer in the idea that when people are given a physical image of something, they do a better job of addressing it. I think we're obviously we should move past just seeing things, and physically we should believe, as a community of faith. But I do think that giving people the idea that what the problem is are these negative grooves in the brain is helpful because of the physical description. Do you think that's true?
Well, I do, but I think the more important point is that it's true. I mean, that's what Paul's getting at in Romans 6. Flesh, or let's just say bad habits that are counterproductive to a life of flourishing and the fruit of the Spirit, reside in your body parts. You have muscle memory. I have penmanship flesh. That means I've got bad habits in the way I write the English alphabet. And those aren't in my shoulders, they're in my wrists and fingers. You may have bad habits in playing the piano. Well, what you have to do is you've got to practice with those body parts so that you take the grooves that are in there that are counterproductive to golf or piano or writing, and replace them with new grooves that make you a good in penmanship or the piano or whatever it is. Same is true with life. There's no doubt in my mind there's a soul. I've spent my life arguing for the soul, and our thoughts and all that sort of thing are in fact in the soul, not the brain. Just like the music from a CD is in the room. It's not in the CD, but what is in the CD are grooves that when triggered will produce music in the room. Well, we have grooves in the brain, which when triggered will produce emotions and thoughts in the mind. And so what we want to do is to get rid of the flesh in our brains and nervous system, which means just the distorted habits that are grooved in there, and replace them with life-giving, joyful grooves. And that's what practice and habit formation does.
So the last question that I have for you is, in a time where with restrictions, with civil unrest, with just crazy amounts of uncertainty, what is your message to the people who are suffering today more than ever?
Number one, this is going to be over with someday. This isn't going to be forever. So hang in there, because it will come to an end, and it's closer now than it was. Number two, take this opportunity as a chance to enter more into some new habit forming practices, like being contemplative quiet prayer. Now, in Finding Quiet, I list 4 of these practices that the kind of quarantine situation actually opens up the possibility of starting to work on these more intently. So take advantage, don't waste it. Take advantage of the situation and turn something good out of it. And then finally, I would say that you desperately need to have real human contact with if you have a good group of solid friends. Now, there's a limit as to how many people I guess you can have, and you have to stay under that. Be wise, of course. But we had a couple over for dinner last night that are very dear friends, and it was life-giving just to be with them. And you don't have to be tucked away in your closet for 6 months. You can still have people over, or you can go to their places if you do it wisely, and so on. You need that social contact, so don't abandon it entirely.